I'm going to be introducing today's special guest in just a few minutes. But first, I would like to address our listeners regarding what I feel we as inhabitants of this planet should be seriously pondering and asking ourselves as we read and hear about the ever-increasing and very disturbing earth and climate changes that are now confronting us and doing so in such a formidable way. What we should be asking ourselves are questions that strike fear in the hearts of all living things. Most notably, what is happening to our earth and atmosphere? Why is it happening at this particular time in our Earth's history? Why is it happening so frequently and at such an alarming rate? And what can each of us do to prepare for each new disaster that lies in wake as a result of these sudden changes? There are some of us in this world that, quite frankly, are very confused. We're bewildered and searching for real answers, especially in lieu of what we see developing on a grand scale. Those who are a bit confused are not really certain who to approach when asking for concrete answers, whether it be government politicians, church leaders, teachers, scientists, or even psychics, who sometimes have the uncanny ability to see and foretell of events that most of us are powerless to understand and deal with. Each of these groups of people just mentioned have their own unique reasoning and beliefs, and each genuinely believes that they have the correct answers to those important questions that we seek. But do any of these groups, or any of us for that matter, have any inclination as to why the earth is behaving as it is these days? And yet in all of the confusion, there may be some answers in the way of clues and warnings that each of us listening here today could take for face value if we're so inclined to do so. Or, on the other hand, like so many do, it may be taken with a grain of salt, which is very unfortunate in the times in which we now live. In the midst of all the chaos and confusion, there is a voice, a stern warning that has emanated from within a certain society, that being the Hopi Indian civilization. These are words so spoken by one of their chosen representatives that each of us should now take to heart, especially as we pay eyewitness to the great changes now occurring on this planet. In their address to the United Nations on December the 10th of 1992, these words were spoken by way of warning to all the inhabitants of the earth, and I quote, "The earth will witness increasing floods, more damaging hurricanes, hailstones, climate change, and earth changes, as our prophecies have forewarned. Why do animals act like they know about the earth's problems, and most humans act like they know nothing? If we humans do not wake up to the warnings, the great purification will come to destroy this world in the same manner as the previous worlds were destroyed." Well, those are some very powerful words, aren't they, folks? Surely their meaning is being felt even today, with all that is happening not only here, but in virtually every continent and country across the globe. So is it possible that our guest today can enlighten us and provide some explanation as to why mankind is struggling for answers, as to how a generation of people can survive an ever-changing world? Well, we're about to find out. Today's guest really needs no introduction, as she has been on the media talk show circuit for many years and has diligently devoted her time, energy, and talents to informing the general public by all means possible about a rogue planet that crosses through our solar system approximately every 3,600 years and has the exceptional ability to interfere with the Earth's magnetic force, resulting in a rotational shutdown and inevitably resulting in a major pole shift. Now, does this sound far-fetched? Not really, when you consider that some notable people and societies have spoken of this celestial body in prophecy and throughout our history, from the time of Noah's flood, as well as the parting of the Red Sea during the time of the Jewish exile. There are many things that need explaining, folks, and there is more to the story than that which is being told us today. So who better to explain all of this in more detail than our next guest? So let's welcome to our program the renowned ET contactee and mistress of Zeta Talk, Miss Nancy Slater. Hi, Nancy.
Oh, I'm so happy to be with you.
Nancy, you and I have become acquaintances as a result of our belief that the Earth is changing on a scale unprecedented in our lifetimes, and that mankind is along for this grand ride. And all of this occurring while both man and his Earth continues to evolve. When I first had the opportunity to communicate with you in the spring of 2003, a score of individuals had already contacted you via your website and had submitted a number of photos, some very credible, that were showing a large planetary object moving quite steadily towards the proximity of the sun. Some of those observers, including myself at the time, had never known of Planet X until they had heard individuals such as yourself, James McKinney, Zachariah Sitchin, as well as other notables explaining the origins of this mysterious rogue planet in its rather peculiar sling orbit through our solar system, as I mentioned, every 3,600 years. I wonder if you could take a few minutes to refresh or inform our listeners about this strange planet and how it may interact with the Earth as it supposedly has in the distant past, according to ancient prophecy.
Sure. Actually, it has a very odd orbit. Really, there is no name for this orbit in among our human astrophysicists, who think that orbits should go round and round, around a sun, or perhaps if there's two binary suns in a close dance, they go around both those binary suns, like our moon goes around the Earth. But this has a sling orbit, and it goes past our two different suns. It doesn't go around them like a big egg. It's kind of like a pendulum swinging back and forth with our sun on one end and another sun on the other end. Now, it's not that far distant. According to the Zeta's 18.74 Sun-Pluto distances, you take the distance from the Sun to Pluto and bop that out 18.74 times, and that's where that other sun is. Why don't we see it? It has never lit. It is a dark, unlit sun. But nevertheless, it's a mass, and our sun is a binary with it, but instead of having a binary dance, they're just kind of frozen. And this is because of, the Zetas say, all the little pushes and pulls from the neighborhood. It's kind of like in an equilibrium stasis, and they don't move. But this planet began to sling past one and then sling past the other when everything was congealing coming out of the Big Bang, and has never been able to stop that. It's sort of locked into that. The sling orbit, as you mentioned, takes place about every 3,600 years. According to the Zetas, every 3,657 years on average, can wiggle around a little bit, depending on what it encounters in space. And most of the time in this sling orbit, it's stuck between the two, slowly moving, along, in the direction. But then it picks up speed and zooms past the sun. It goes from the midpoint between the two to reach one of its suns in about 7 years, and then inches past that sun, and then zooms on a little bit further, and then turns around because both of its gravity giants are behind it, and starts the process back. So we're right now in the position where it zoomed into our solar system in 2003, which was a time when we had dramatic second sun rising. People would say, I saw two suns rise, and we caught some of this on photo too. There's a few that are really undeniable and very dramatic, but we got an awful lot of people just reporting that they saw two suns rising and were stunned. This is because the Earth at that time was on the opposite side of the sun. Planet X comes zooming into our solar system from the direction of Orion, as legend says. And we were on the opposite end of the side of the sun, so the sun's rays bounced off its massive dust cloud, which shrouds it, and back toward us, which made it look like a second sun rising. And this is of legend. People talk about two suns or the second sun. And indeed, you're right. It is in legend, Book of Exodus, the Jewish Exodus, also documented in the Kolbrin, which is Egyptian records. It's called the Kolbrin Bible because it parallels, so much of what the Bible says. And the Kolbrin also details a lot of what went on during the period of the flood, much more so than the Bible does. And it's a fascinating read because it tells you what people were experiencing, the droughts, the plagues of insects, the hailstones, and then they begin to see this orb in the sky, and the last weeks what they go through. A lot of some things that are very mysterious. One thing that just came to light is in the Kolbrin it says that Egyptian women could not conceive and aborted. In the weeks prior to the Jewish Exodus. And I thought, well, what's that? Because we haven't experienced that. Well, boy, we started doing that this year because there was a thread on the Godlike Production message boards talking about people having odd dizziness, odd nausea ringing in their ear. They would go to the doctor. They could find nothing wrong. And so many people leapt in, hundreds of people, and said, oh, I've had that. And it's very strange. Went to the doctor, could find nothing wrong. And they said, and female troubles. And the female troubles that were being reported was, it's as though they were having their period too often. Well, that would be like aborting, an early pregnancy also. So according to the Zetas, this is a reaction to the elements in the tail of Planet X, which is massive, and it's swooping around us at times. We have odd halos around the sun and the moon over the last few years since it has arrived in 2003, and also more debris, more fireballs, and there's components, petrocarbon kind of components in the tail. So it's due to that. So I think I've nattered on. Did I cover your question?
Yes, you did, Nancy, very well, as you always do on every talk show that you've ever been on. What I wanted to know, I guess what a lot of the listeners, I'm sure, are curious to find out at this time is, what is the particular location or the approximate location of this planetary body, Planet X?
Yeah, it often confuses people immensely. You mentioned the photos that we have and the like. Well, it came into the solar system and zoomed in. It was, within our orbit, closer to Venus's orbit, that close to the sun by summer of 2003. But in 2001 and 2002, it was in our night sky, and it was like a dim star, and people were tracking it. They went to observatories and could see a dim blur in the area. The Zetas would give what's called the Ra and Dec, which is right angle and declination. It's kind of like the X and Y coordinates in the sky. And they'd find 3 different observatories, one in France, one in Vancouver, and one in Arizona. Teams went there and sighted it. And then by 2002, we were doing infrared. And people in France and in the U.S. sighted it infrared at the coordinates. And then it got close enough that we could do it with CCD imaging, which they did out of place in, I think, Arizona, and captured it, and it would be like a dim star that was not on the star charts, and it would move according to the Ra and Dec coordinates. It would disappear from where it was a week ago and be at a new spot, and it was always moving very close in coordination with what the Zetas were predicting. But then it rolled into the spring, March 26th of 2003, and you could see it in the evening skies out near Orion. I personally got a chance to see it. It was stunning. It was like a little red light that would come winking and then disappear and wink and then disappear, kind of a red blur there, and there was no other star in that area. People by the score were reporting seeing this from around the world. Then it swung into the daytime because it would be closer to the sun than out in the dark, and it was lost in the blur of the sun. What has happened and what is so confusing to people is that our Earth has been halted in its orbit. We're not talking about rotation, the Earth going round and round 24 hours in a day. I'm talking about trucking around the sun once a year. We came around the sun toward the December position, which is where Planet X was, as it was slowly passing the sun. It creeps past the sun, and then zooms on out when it gets past the sun. So it's all the dynamics of gravity and a gravity, like an anti-gravity force, which is called a repulsion force, that causes that slow creep. But in any case, Planet X halted the Earth in her orbit because Earth encountered Planet X more or less in her way, in front of her, and it's huge. This planet is 4 times the diameter of Earth, 23 times the mass, and the gravity pull is much more than Earth. So the repulsion force triggered in. Now what has happened since then, we have been trapped in that kind of a position where Planet X is between us and the Sun, and it's kind of pushing us backwards in our orbit and creeping toward us at the same time. We're like snow in front of a snowplow in that regard. What traps us is partially the eddy flow of particles that come out from the Sun and roll around Planet X and then roil in front of Planet X, and we can't get out of that. I use an example of a stick in a river where if you find a branch stuck in a river, the water will flow around it, and right in front of that stick you might find things bobbling in the water that would have long ago washed downstream, but they can't get out of that bobbling around because the water coming around the sides, that flow is so strong. It's an eddy flow, a backwards flow, pushing those little bobbling seeds or whatever back toward the stick. Well, we're in that position. We can't escape. And Venus is likewise in that position. It is a second dark planet, which is called the Earth Twin, which used to be right behind the Sun all the time so we could never see it, although NASA was aware of it by their probes and the like. And it has come around and won't bump into us, shares our orbit, because of the repulsion force. But those 3 planets, which are all about the same size, Venus is about the same size as Earth, and our dark twin, which is just a dark hunk of rock, people were actually able to see it as it was coming around in early 2004, and it was like a blue and yellow light thing out in the west. People were talking about it, and we captured it on photo also. It's in my photos section. But then the angle was such that the sunlight bounced right back toward the Sun. Black normally does not reflect anything, but it was just at a particular angle which some of those light rays were deflecting back toward Earth, and we saw it briefly for a month or 2 there in the spring of 2004. So we're trapped in the eddy flow. It's coming at us from the direction of the Sun. We can't get out of its way. It's not going to veer or turn away. It's just going to zoom over our head, coming from slightly below the Sun to slightly above. And in legend, in the Colbrin, I was thrilled to find this, it says it comes from the direction of the Sun. Comes from the direction of the Sun. And
that's pretty amazing in
yes,
itself.
That is. I was thrilled to see that. It was such a confirmation of what the Zetas had been saying.
I had a question here. The Mayan elders have foretold of the year 2012 in prophecy as a time of the Great Awakening. Could the term Great Awakening be another way to define a time of great upheaval, such as would occur with the crossing of the Planet X?
Yes, frequently. If you're, as the Zetas say, if your world is upside down anyway, it's a time when if you present a lot of new ideas, they're likely to be less upsetting than if everything is status quo and calm. So they said, for instance, during the pole shift, when everybody is dealing with, Lord, what has just happened, in my life, and my house blew away, and the sun is rising and setting in a different place, and what does this mean? And you may, in fact, encounter aliens in your conscious who might become your new neighbors, because when you're shook up like that, your mind is more open to new concepts, and the fact that your neighbors look a little odd, are kind of bald and speak telepathically and fly around in spaceships is the least of your worries. So, the awakening is a term that the Zetas have used to describe people becoming aware that they're galactic citizens, that man is not alone. And of course, some of us have known that, from jump, but the way the government has gone about it with Blue Book and everything is swamp gas and berating anybody who says they're a contactee, treating them like an enemy of the state, lately it's gone the other way because they've lost this game to try to pretend that UFOs don't exist. The number of contactees has ballooned exponentially, and mass sightings are happening all the time. And so now, videos and photos are showing up more and more, and people are talking openly, and governments are giving up. In France, they've opened their UFO files. The UK is going to do that partially. The government in Chile, the military in Chile, sent representatives to a UFO conference there to talk about some of their documented cases. And in the U.S., we're just as tight as a crab's ass, I guess is the way I've heard somebody say it. I don't think they have an ass, but anyway, in other words, Bush doesn't want to give an inch, on any of this, and we're still ridiculing. Although I was stunned to see Fox come out and talk about Roswell, and allow some guy to natter on for almost 5 minutes about famous UFO cases and how these military officers are making deathbed confessions or whatever, and that Roswell really was aliens and spaceship UFOs and the like. So the awakening, in my mind, is talking about becoming aware of that we're galactic citizens and life elsewhere exists, and not being frightened, by the idea of meeting aliens, as contactees are all the time.
Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there are many people out there, well, even today, who have no inclination or understanding with respect to the events that are occurring on Earth, and for that matter, in the heavens. I would like to address the Zetas with a question, Nancy.
Sure.
That I'm sure is on the minds of many folks who are listening to this program today. Mm-hmm. There are many changes taking place on the Earth that we as humans do not understand, as their origin has not been fully explained to us. We are now being told by the media that the Earth and climate changes are the result of severe warming due to the drastic buildup of greenhouse gases and man's negligence in curtailing the emission of CO2 into our atmosphere. My question to the Zetas, is man to blame for the massive Earth and climate changes we are now experiencing, as we are being led to believe? Or could it be that forces outside the control of mankind are playing a significant role with the events that are unfolding before us?
And here's Zeta Talk on that. And when I'm done wrapping English around the concepts that the Zetas give me, I'll say end of Zeta Talk so that you know it's back to old Nancy Talk.
Okay.
And here's Zeta Talk. We have explained that global warming is not due to man's emissions, a small fraction, of course, but the changes are due to the roiling within the core of the Earth caused by the presence and approach of Planet X. It's a large magnet. The Earth is a large magnet. Gravity, attraction, and push-pull are involved, along with many other particle flows that man is not aware of. Man is aware of 1 out of 1,000, perhaps, particles, subatomic particles that we Zetas are aware of, and it does no good to try to explain them all, because we would be in school forever in Particle Flow 101. So trust us that there are particles flowing in and out of the sun and around every planet, all of which have the core of the Earth roiled up as Planet X is approaching. It disturbs the equilibrium. Yes, there's change, and this is because the equilibrium that has been in place in the solar system, which man is used to, has changed. So this is causing volcanism to be exponentially at the present time increasing. More volcanoes in the memory of man was a phrase that was being used 7 years ago on Nancy's website, and now it's even more so. They become active and they stay active. They were considered dormant and to be forever dormant, and suddenly they are awakened. And this is increasingly the case. One has to go in and do a bit of research, as some people have done, but there's 3 times as many volcanoes active as there were approximately 6-7 years ago. This is not due to global warming. Heat rises. Heat creates air turbulence, but it doesn't create turmoil in the magma, nor an increase in earthquakes. Well, take a look at the earthquake databases and all looks the same. But as anyone following this closely knows, the USGS has been dropping large earthquakes. If they're out in the ocean and they can get away with it, they drop it, dumbing down the Richter. If it's a 7, they make it a 6.5, and now if it's a 7, they make it a 5.3. And this immensely changes the statistics. They do this to make the statistics look pretty equivalent this year as they did in years past. But people have watched these quakes being gutted from databases in front of their eyes. So this is also not a cause of global warming. We predicted today's weather back in 1995, increasing drought and deluge, increasing hurricanes, occurring in places not used to hurricanes, tornadoes in places not used to tornadoes. All of this has come around, and temperature extremes also outside of and their records are being broken right and left. Well, we did not explain at the time that this would be caused by a wobble. Earth is in a wobble. Many people will notice that the moon is not where it should be. The sun is rising and setting too far to the north the last few months, and they'll comment about it if they're at all used to noticing, like they've lived in a house for decades and they've always had the sun come through such a window and now it doesn't anymore, or it comes through a window it's never come in before. They notice these things. This is because we lean and look back and forth and wobble. Now, some of what goes on in the Earth as being controlled by benign aliens. When we mentioned that Earth is stopped in her orbit, people would say, well, then why aren't we in a perpetual December position? Because we pull the north pole of the Earth toward the sun for summer and let it ease back for winter again, so that inhabitants of Earth do not freeze and fry. And we have done this for the last few pole shifts since the Earth became inhabited by humans and was incarnating souls. So, but the wobble is in place and can be detected by observers, and this wobble will pull the Earth under the atmosphere and will cause this extreme weather conditions that we're having, where rain on Texas just doesn't stop, and the drought in the Southwest, it just doesn't seem to stop either. Or where you have Florida, of all places, in a drought situation and burning even the swamps of Florida, and then turn around and be drowned. So this is because of the wobble. So it is not global warming. Al Gore is saying so only to get out there and have his face in front of the public, because as our last legitimate, popularly elected president, which he was in 2000, and held in esteem by the masses, he may at some point have to take a position in a government where Bush and Cheney are pulled aside and arrested for their crimes. So he stays on the stage and espouses global warming for that reason. And Inconvenient Truth, if anyone watches it, was a lot more about Al Gore's life than it was about global warming. And this is the reason. They have no other way to explain the weather changes, and the governments of the world are not ready to explain that a passage of Planet X is in their future. So they keep screaming global warming. They feel they have no other option at the present time. And this is the end of Zeta Talk.
Well, there you have it, folks. Direct from the Zetas. What more can we say? I'd like to switch gears here just a bit and talk about how the Planet X in particular will affect the Earth in such a manner as to create a pole shift, which I believe you had previously mentioned would be sudden and drastic in nature.
Yeah, although there's a lot of lead-in signs. And to begin with, the Zetas were just sort of describing a slowing rotation to a rotation stop and then pole shift within an hour and that type of thing. And so everybody was watching their clocks like crazy, worried about a slowing rotation. But then they got a lot more specific about, in legend, like the Bible will talk about 3 days of darkness is pending, and Islam talks about 6 days of sunrise west, and the like. And so the Zetas have, and of course there's an indication of a wobble, like the Bible says, the Earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, So the Zetas got specific. What happens as Planet X passes the sun, it also goes from below the ecliptic, which is this, the ecliptic is this line through the sun's middle that all the planets line up on, similar to the rings of Saturn, except the only thing in the ecliptic are the various planets that go around the sun, not a lot of trash, but we have that. It's an invisible, hat ring, like the rings of Saturn. So Planet X goes from below the sun slightly to slightly above the sun on its way out. And when it does so, because it's such a large magnet, it has to line up along the sun's magnetic field lines. And at first, when it's coming toward the South Pole, it's nosing its North Pole directly at the sun's South Pole, and it kind of stays glued, and then it's tipping. So now you've got it almost laying horizontally with its North Pole pointed at the sun's South Pole and its South Pole pointed out toward us. And then it turns in place, and it turns around and turns its North Pole toward us, getting ready to be above the ecliptic, where it's got to have its South Pole pointing at the sun's North Pole. I know this is North and South a headache, but the bottom line is right now it's in the process. It's pretty close to the ecliptic. It's between the Earth and the Sun. It's coming toward us. It's in the home stretch here, going toward a pole shift, and it's in the process of swinging its north pole around. It's almost 3/4 of the way around. It's not pointing its north pole directly at us yet, but it's pretty close to that. And when it does point the north pole directly at us, our north pole will tip away. You know how magnets are. You can't get two north poles to touch no matter what you do. You put them together, and then they're just, it's like there's grease between them, and they keep jumping around because they either want to be side by side or end to end, but they don't want to be north pole to north pole. And because that's where the magnetic particles flow out, and it's just like two little hoses pointed at each other. So as the north pole of Planet X is starting to point toward us, our north pole tips away, and that's the 3 days of darkness in the northern hemisphere. And then, in tipping away, it kind of overreacts, and it tips all the way upside down, but it's a slow, gentle tip upside down. Well, if we're standing on our head, and north is down and south is up, and we would keep our same rotation, going round and round, guess where the sun is? It would appear to rise from the west, which is what Islam says, 6 days of sunrise west. And then we tip back up, and we're straight up, and at this point, Planet X, in its role and in its manipulations as it's doing this, getting ready to cross the ecliptic and adjust to the magnetic field lines above the ecliptic, that's when we will slow to a stop, and it happens within several days. The Zetas have said something that must be terribly frightening to people who go through this, is that the Earth is actually drawn toward Planet X at that time by, it sounds to me like about 30 million miles. We're like 93 million miles. We're a lot closer to the Sun. We're a lot closer to Planet X during that week when we slow down and we're in rotation stoppage. That's really 2 weeks. 1 week we're stopped, and a few days that we're slowing down, so let's say 1.5 weeks. And then, all of a sudden, there's an hour of a pole shift because Planet X takes off suddenly. It says, I'm above the ecliptic. I'm free at last. And it takes off. And as it zooms overhead, we attempt to follow it, as far as our North Pole attempts to tip away, or South Pole attempt, whatever, and we attempt to do a 180 flip as it's passing overhead. We only get 90% of the way, and it's gone. But that's why our North Pole will be on the equator, South Pole will be on the equator. India will be the new South Pole, and off the bulge of Brazil will be the new North Pole. It's during that hour that happens. So the reason in legend that they say that Planet X gets so large and is coming at us from the sun, and it appears to be as large as the sun and like a writhing dragon, the tail blows out from its North Pole. The tail is blowing toward us with all that debris and red dust writhing in the moon swirls, and it looks like, probably the tentacles of an octopus, and it's horrifying. So this happens during that week, that long 1.5 weeks, because we're very close to each other, and it's a terrifying time. Here in the North American continent, we will be stuck in the long dawn, but though over there in Europe and Egypt and the like, they will be in the long day, and it's going to be a hot day. People do survive, otherwise we wouldn't be hearing about this, and we wouldn't have all this stuff written down.
This probably sounds like a coincidence or a deja vu or whatever we may want to refer to it as, but in preparation for this program, I was reading a book written by John White, who's an internationally known author, and he's a lecturer in the field of parascience and human development. And his book is entitled Pole Shift, Scientific Predictions and Prophecies of the Ultimate Natural Disaster. In his book, White, he references Dr. Immanuel Velikovsky, who's a Russian psychiatrist and historian born in 1895. And who laid claim to the concept that radical changes have and are occurring within our solar system. And he did this in a book that he published in 1950, which you might know, Nancy. It's called Worlds in Collision.
Oh, yeah.
So foreign was Velikovsky's concepts among highly educated scientists of his time that his works were eventually suppressed as being too revolutionary in their meaning. What he had proposed in his studies was that Venus had in recent times been born as a comet ejected from Jupiter. He then goes on to say that Venus wandered the solar system, nearly colliding with the Earth in the 15th century BC, causing the Earth to rock on its axis twice and slip its crust as well. Now, 8 centuries later, Venus again disrupted the solar system, causing Mars to wander erratically into a near collision with the Earth, with much the same results as in the 15th century. Now, according to Velikovsky, the forces involved in accomplishing this were electromagnetic in nature and not gravitational. He claims that during these events, the Earth's orbit was altered and its rotation was temporarily slowed. At this time, the compass points changes, the climate changes, and the length of the day and year changes. He says that perhaps 3,500 years ago, the poles had reversed locations. Indeed, as a result of global tilting, there would be extended darkness in one portion of the world and extended daylight in others, which is exactly what Exodus chapter 10, verses 22 relates, when it says, and I'll quote this, "And there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days."
Mm-hmm.
Several Egyptian papyri tell of the earth being turned upside down, mm-hmm, to where the south becomes north, and signs of the constellations are then reversed. In effect, the sun rises to the west and sets in the east. Nancy, aren't we beginning to see the reality here of Velikovsky's concepts with respect to the Earth's continents shifting and the stars changing course?
Oh, yes, absolutely. This was one of his earlier books, Worlds in Collision, where he picks up folklore, basically. And he followed it. His last one, I believe, was Earth in Upheaval, which actually is repeating scientific studies of the geology of the Earth, what's measured in the geology of the Earth, and not talking about folklore and legend at all. You know, like the fact that the 3,600 years ago or so, all the oceans of the world worldwide dropped 16 to 20 feet. And they determined this, Daly and other scientists, by the fact that their beaches were so high they were no longer being washed by waves, but they had been, and they were able to do like carbon dating kind of thing and determine, and so, well, where did all that water go? Obviously, the great rifts in the ocean, like the Atlantic Rift, deepened, for instance. And he was attempting to take all of this information and make sense out of it. And there was another author by the name of Hapgood who had the sliding crust theory, which Einstein espoused and said it made the most sense in as far as why we have wandering poles and the like. The crust actually moves. It's not that the magnetism points out our left ear and then out our right ear and then out the top of our head. I mean, that's not what's going on. The crust is shifting around. Ice ages are, in fact, where like France was the North Pole at one point, Wisconsin was the North Pole. Our last pole was Greenland, which is why there's so much ice there. It's such a pack, and it's the crust shifts. So for those who don't know, not only did Einstein espouse Hapgood, but he and Velikovsky were very close friends, played chess. And when Einstein died, Velikovsky's book Earth in Upheaval was open on his desk. He was in the process of reading it when he died.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And this business about Venus zipping around in Mars, you know, there was, I think the Mayan Indians had something called a 52-year round, you know, where it was a celebration or human sacrifice or something like that. Every 52 years when Venus would loom close. Well, what happens during a passage is sometimes these planets like Venus, you know, which is very much caught up and in front of planet X like the Earth is, their orbit gets wingy, and it takes a while for it to go back to where it ought to be. And so in this orbit, if Earth's orbit is a little wanged out and Venus's orbit is a little wanged out on certain, you know, so many years, we might come close to each other, and that was what it was considered. So they'd see Venus come too close, and everybody'd hold their breath, and then they'd have this celebration, and then it would go away, and they'd say, we're good for another 51 years. So Velikovsky did his very best, and at first he wasn't thinking rogue planet, but as he moved along, he was getting close to that, you know, as describing it. It wasn't until we got Zechariah Sitchin with documenting the ancient Sumerians' understanding of what he called the 12th planet, which in legend may be called the Red Star, the Great Grand Destroyer, Nibiru, Wormwood, Marduk. There's lots of different terms for this big planet that comes zooming through, and he called it the 12th planet because the ancient Sumerians counted that planet as one and our moon as one, as well as Pluto and all the other planets and the sun, I think. So anyway, his book is the 12th planet, and he has a series of books which address what the ancient Sumerians knew. They counted the planets from the outside in. They were aware of Pluto and our outer planets, Uranus and the like, before we ever discovered them. I mean, we didn't discover them until after the 1900, 1930, or whatever the heck it was. I mean, the ancient Sumerians knew about them and counted out in, which is what this planet does. It comes into our solar system from the outside in. And this planet, this traveling planet, It is inhabited. It's a water planet, and it does have hominoids on it, as our planet has hominoids on it. And they have rocket ships like we have the shuttle. And when they came through and passed through years past, they would pick up gold that had been mined on Earth, and they needed it for their atmosphere to try to retain heat and light, because their planet is not only a big magnet, it also has some components that suns do, so that it's a smoldering brown dwarf. It emits heat and light, and is shrouded in this dust, so that it's covered with a dust cloud. But their water is blue, and it's lit by some deep crevasses in their oceans, and so it does have vegetation, and it does have these transplanted hominoids, which are the guys that built the giant pyramids and the face on Mars too. They've gone up there to mine for gold. So I forget what the question was. I've been wandering and talking here.
Well, we were talking about Velikovsky.
Oh, yeah.
And what I wanted to say was, it seems, well, to me, the most startling concept that Velikovsky elaborated on was his belief, and I believe that it's your belief as well, Nancy, that a shifting of the Earth's axis are not brought about by internal causes,
right,
as proponents of the Ice Age theory had assumed, but rather under the impact of external forces.
Right.
That worldwide phenomena such as climate change, the transgression and rising of the seas, great volcanic and seismic activity, animal extinction, and a host of other cataclysmic events would only take place as a result of an external magnetic force.
Right. It's magnetic, and magnets are very strong. You know, you can get a thing to levitate off the floor with electromagnetism. People say, oh, well, some of these people that are trying to claim that mankind can levitate, spaceships, like aliens can levitate spaceships, and they get these powerful electromagnetic fields, and the chair lifts up off the floor, and they say, look, we can fly spaceships. Well, it is a very powerful force, magnetism is, yes, and that's exactly what's happening. It's when it happens so quickly that our planet, is the core wants to go one way and the crust wants to go another way at the point of passage, and the core, gets ripped off. I mean, the core and the crust separate, and that slippery zone between, which is magma, liquid magma, and it causes the crust is just sliding over. And for people on Earth, what they notice is that there's like a jiggling feeling. The stars or the moon or whatever seem to move across the sky quickly. And you know how it is when you fall. It's not the fall that hurts. It's that sudden stop at the bottom. It's the same thing with the pole shift where the crust is on the moon. It's when that crust stops moving. And Richter 9 earthquakes worldwide. The Zetas call them Richter 15, but Richter is a factor of the force of the jolt and the scope. So it's really Richter 9, that kind of a jolt. So if they say don't be in buildings, be in a trench somewhere, the trees stay rooted, and if you just crouch down out of the winds, of course there's hurricane force winds worldwide because the crust is moving under the atmosphere pretty rapidly.
Well, Nancy, as we're talking right now, it's beginning to storm here, and I'm hoping that we haven't lost our internet connection, but I want you to go on ahead and continue.
Yeah, I'll just keep talking. And they say it's very terrifying, but for those people that know the signs to look for, by the time we get to 3 days of darkness and we're upside down, or even get a real severe wobble going into that point, but it would get a lean to the left. Our North Pole will seem to be dropping over to the left into where we're almost laid out on our side instead of straight up and down, and then the North Pole swings back into being away from the sun. You've got only weeks left, to go, and the really violent wobble, you've only got 4 months at most left. So, don't pay the mortgage after this point, and head for the hills, basically. Be someplace away from the coastlines. Get seeds, fishing hooks. Fishing will be good. Ocean fishing will be very good. There's something that popped up. The Zetas have always said this. They said the oceans will be lush, and there was a study that was just recently published that said if you cast iron onto the ocean, there's the algae and the kelp and the like suck up the carbon dioxide and the iron, and there's a lot of food for the fish to eat, vegetation, and the ocean actually looks pea green. And this is what the Zetas were describing. They've been saying ocean fishing will be very good afterwards, and because the iron dust in the tail will waft over, it makes small ponds and rivers look blood red. But the blood red rivers of Revelations But for the oceans, it's going to make all the kelp and the seaweed and everything grow and renew the oxygen in the air, and the fish will recover. We're going to have heavy die-off on the coastlines. The recent studies have said, the reports have said almost half of all mankind is living in cities at this current time. Well, and most of those cities are in river bottoms or on coastlines. You know there's going to be a lot of death from drowning, and that buildings will drop on people in cities. So the oceans won't be fished out. But you've got to get up in the hills. Remember to distill your water. There's a lot of easy ways to do this, easy techniques. Check my website. There's hints on how to do this with pots and pans, and you can get a gallon of distilled water in no time over a fire, and then have hot washing water as an offset. Remember, bugs are good to eat, and also weeds. There's a lot of weeds in vitamin C, vitamin A. You would be surprised. Things that we dig out of our garden and throw away are just as nutritious as lettuce and cabbage and the like that we pay money for. So look into low-light plants like potatoes. I have sheep sorrel, which is sky high in vitamin C, which is a weed growing in my lawn, which I treasure. Get familiar with that, and think of living like the Amish do, like 100 years ago, off the grid, hand tools, and teaching your children at your knee how to live, and it's going to be peaceful and moving into better times for the survivors. You still there with me?
I'm still with you, Nancy. I was just looking at my clock here because I've lost my internet connection. I think we got like about 6 minutes left, and I did want to ask you one more question.
Sure.
Before we leave today. It's being reported by a number of close observers that the sun's orbit across the ecliptic appears to be out of sync. Instead of moving steadily towards the southern hemisphere as it normally would, progressing into the summer solstice, it appears to be moving very little. In fact, it has been taking a northerly track as it crosses the horizon. Are people's eyes deceiving them when they're making these observations?
Oh, no.
This is what is actually occurring.
Yeah, that's actually, well, actually, it's the way the Earth is leaning, and this has been reported since, I think, March, that everything was too far to the north, and people make measurements, like I live on a street that is absolutely east-west, north-south, east-west. I live on a corner. And this was laid out in the Midwest, way back when, and the Midwest is like little grids all over the place. They were very precise. My block is on the 40 marker, and so you can just do an estimate and say, okay, it's supposed to be 70 degrees and 90 is east, and then 20 over. But 20, 30 degrees too far, So people have been measuring this and measuring the wobble. I get people to measure the wobble from around the globe because somebody in Australia or Japan and Europe and South America, Chile, they're all recording where they see the constellations, where they see the sun come up and go down, and the like. And you can, and it's a detectable wobble. Did that in 2000 and into 2005 to a great extent. It's very time consuming. Did it recently, this last spring, because people were talking about such a dramatic wobble. But what has been consistently being reported on message boards is the sun is too far north on rising and too far north on setting. Now, it will depend a little bit on where you are. I think, Europe gets one thing and we get another thing, but it has been at best where more or less what it should be, but most certainly too far north, when it's off. And you can go into my website and look at the orbits section and see some of this recent documentation. Their eyes are not deceiving them. They will be told that if they call an astronomy club, and these astronomy clubs have somebody who's answering to, like NASA or an astronomer, and astronomers, have to, in order to work at observatories and universities, they have to sign little security oaths that they won't talk about UFOs, for instance, and they also are told don't talk about, how the Earth is wobbling around and where things aren't where they're supposed to be, on pain of death, pretty much. That people have died, and the word gets around. The story that in 2001, when the crew went to an observatory in Vancouver to look, and the astronomer there, who was a vice president of their Royal Astronomical, whatever the heck in Canada, he was trying everything he could to have them not look where they wanted to look, and they finally did get a look there by some assistant. But this man pulled, Steve aside, it's a different Steve up there in Vancouver, and said, Steve Havas, and said, look, don't. If you keep your mouth shut, you can come on a certain place and time, and we'll look at it. I mean, we're watching it all the time, and I know what you're talking about, and it's coming in. But keep your mouth shut. Well, Steve Hobbs didn't. He reported this, so then the guy was in a panic. NASA came up and did a lecture there at that very same observatory, Gordon McMillan, and the next week, and trying to in other words, NASA's presence was very heavily felt, right, at the observatory.
I think we have 1 minute left on the program. It just popped back up, and we got 1 minute left.
Yeah. Well, the bottom line is this poor astronomer, who was told, don't talk to Steve Hobbs, and he was approaching him in the hallway, and the guy ran into the ladies' room to avoid Steve Hobbs. I mean, that's how panicked he was about this whole issue. They're told, don't talk, so it's a big cover-up. Yeah, your eyes are not deceiving you. You have to trust your eyes. You're not getting the truth. One of these days, that whole cover-up will break, and I think it'll be when we start seeing something in the sky that they can't deny. They may try to call it a big asteroid swarm or something like that, or an anomaly in the atmosphere, it's a reflection of the sun, or some solar flare that cut loose and is floating like a ball of light, and who knows what the explanation will be, but it'll be something silly. Meanwhile, we'll have a wobble, that'll be increasing. So go to the Theta Talk website and get educated on all this, folks. And thanks to Steve for having me on.
Thank you, Nancy, and I really appreciate you coming on today. We'll reserve the call-in session for another time, okay?
Yes.
All right.
Great.
Thank you very much. Let's have you on again.
Bye, all.
Bye. I'm going to be introducing today's special guest in just a few minutes. But first, I would like to address our listeners regarding what I feel we as inhabitants of this planet should be seriously pondering and asking ourselves as we read and hear about the ever-increasing and very disturbing Earth and climate changes that are now confronting us and doing so in such a formidable way. What we should be asking ourselves are questions that strike fear in the hearts of all living things. Most notably, what is happening to our Earth and atmosphere? Why is it happening at this particular time in our Earth's history? Why is it happening so frequently and at such an alarming rate? And what can each of us do to prepare for each new disaster that lies in wake as a result of these sudden changes? There are some of us in this world that, quite frankly, are very confused. We're bewildered and searching for real answers, especially in lieu of what we see developing on a grand scale. Those who are a bit confused are not really certain who to approach when asking for concrete answers, whether it be government politicians, church leaders, teachers, scientists, or even psychics, who sometimes have the uncanny ability to see and foretell of events that most of us are powerless to understand and deal with. Each of these groups of people just mentioned have their own unique reasoning and beliefs, and each genuinely believes that they have the correct answers to those important questions that we seek. But do any of these groups, or any of us for that matter, have any inclination as to why the Earth is behaving as it is these days? And yet in all of the confusion, there may be some answers in the way of clues and warnings that each of us listening here today could take for face value if we're so inclined to do so. Or, on the other hand, like so many do, it may be taken with a grain of salt, which is very unfortunate in the times in which we now live. In the midst of all the chaos and confusion, there is a voice, a stern warning that has emanated from within a certain society, that being the Hopi Indian civilization. These are words so spoken by one of their chosen representatives that each of us should now take to heart, especially as we pay eyewitness to the great changes now occurring on this planet. In their address to the United Nations on December the 10th of 1992, these words were spoken by way of warning to all the inhabitants of the earth, and I quote, "The earth will witness increasing floods, more damaging hurricanes, hailstones, climate change, and earth changes, as our prophecies have forewarned. Why do animals act like they know about the earth's problems, and most humans act like they know nothing? If we humans do not wake up to the warnings, the great purification will come to destroy this world in the same manner as the previous worlds were destroyed. Well, those are some very powerful words, aren't they, folks? Surely their meaning is being felt even today, with all that is happening not only here, but in virtually every continent and country across the globe. So is it possible that our guest today can enlighten us and provide some explanation as to why mankind is struggling for answers, as to how a generation of people can survive an ever-changing world? Well, we're about to find out. Today's guest really needs no introduction, as she has been on the media talk show circuit for many years and has diligently devoted her time, energy, and talents to informing the general public by all means possible about a rogue planet that crosses through our solar system approximately every 3,600 years and has the exceptional ability to interfere with the Earth's magnetic force, resulting in a rotational shutdown and inevitably resulting in a major pole shift. Now, does this sound far-fetched? Not really, when you consider that some notable people and societies have spoken of this celestial body in prophecy and throughout our history, from the time of Noah's flood, as well as the parting of the Red Sea during the time of the Jewish exile. There are many things that need explaining, folks, and there is more to the story than that which is being told us today. So who better to explain all of this in more detail than our next guest? So let's welcome to our program the renowned ET contactee and mistress of Zeta Talk, Miss Nancy Lader. Hi, Nancy.
Oh, I'm so happy to be with you.
Nancy, you and I have become acquaintances as a result of our belief that the Earth is changing on a scale unprecedented in our lifetimes, and that mankind is along for this grand ride. And all of this occurring while both man and his Earth continues to evolve. When I first had the opportunity to communicate with you in the spring of 2003, a score of individuals had already contacted you via your website and had submitted a number of photos, some very credible, that were showing a large planetary object moving quite steadily towards the proximity of the sun. Some of those observers, including myself at the time, had never known of Planet X until they had heard individuals such as yourself, James McKinney, Zachariah Sitchin, as well as other notables explaining the origins of this mysterious rogue planet in its rather peculiar sling orbit through our solar system, as I mentioned, every 3,600 years. I wonder if you could take a few minutes to refresh or inform our listeners about this strange planet and how it may interact with the Earth as it supposedly has in the distant past, according to ancient prophecy.
Sure. Actually, it has a very odd orbit. Really, there is no name for this orbit in among our human astrophysicists who think that orbits should go round and round, around a sun, or perhaps if there's two binary suns in a close dance, they go around both those binary suns.